School is an 18-year forced government training program that sterilizes the potential for brilliance in children. Those who actually survive schooling and survive conformity and continue on to think for themselves truly are a rare breed. All children start out as curious, highly experimental minds, and then one day they're sent to school. Mandatory schooling has never consisted of anything but the memorization of monotonous dead facts and training children to master repetitious behavior. For the greater part of their day, everything the child says must match the interest of their school teachers. Their behavior must coincide with a set policy and a set regulation. They cannot use the bathrooms without permission. If they wish to speak, they must raise their hands. And after every hour or so, a bell rings and everyone must move to it. It couldn't be any more slave-like. And this type of training becomes a ritual for the child. It becomes the plot background for their television shows and books, or the ideology taught to them by a teacher or a parent. An entire monoculture is being developed here, stripping children of their power to cause trouble for the state at an early age, training them to be good servants of the politically correct. Their environment is much like a prison, by the population lacking any ability to check the authority of the warden. The process becomes a matter of rubber stamping. They have no control over their entire lives, which is directly related to youth violence, because the only control they have is between each other. Mandatory schooling produces children who are either terrified of the tyranny of others or have been raised to perpetually exploit the conditions of others. It's just like the prison system. Forced cohabitation. The child's presence in certain buildings and their engagement in state-regulated behavior is under penalty of imprisonment. An entire army of truancy officers have been hired to make sure that no child is on the other side of the bars. At the end of 18 years of coercive state authority, the child is released into the world. It's like the end of an 18-year prison sentence. Now that you're trained to do as you're told, now you can be free. And the produce of these schools, or this state-controlled manufacturing operation, is a society willing to submit, to obey, and to listen. Forced behavior, which technically amounts to a type of slavery, will only inculcate a mindset of fear and terror. You need to be somewhere at a set time, either at the orders of an authority or a bell. Everyone in one mass shifts to another position or another place to engage in a new activity. They're trained to not only follow instruction, but they're also trained to follow a certain behavior. Rules, regulations, and laws are set for the children. They say you cannot do this to others. You can do this to others. This is acceptable. This is not acceptable. Standards of culture, morality, and behavior are imprinted into these new young minds that are in the blossoming stages of development. Their minds are being intercepted by the state and molded to conform to state standards. The first lesson they teach you is the orders of authority. The second lesson is to work with each other to achieve the desired ends of those in control. If a group of children are taught to engage in the same behavior regardless of what they want to do, then they will never fight back as adults. And this is your group of tenants who will live in roaches and never call the health inspector. This is your group of citizens who is easily terrified by police officers into voluntarily giving up their rights. This is your group of workers who surrender their lives to the corporation who tells them how to dress, how to speak, what time to wake up, which means they essentially tell you what time to go to sleep if they tell you what time to wake up. This is nothing new. These are the fruits of mandatory schooling. If we look into the roots of 19th century industrialism, the Civil War demonstrated to industrialists and financiers how a standardized population trained to follow orders without significant thought could be made to function as a money tree. It's no surprise that global power and corporate wealth is based on a third-rate educational system that works against developing individuals of true character and true intellect. Because the mindless bureaucrat or the thoughtless worker who will follow a system without question is the pattern that our system depends on. And this is what school produces. The system is not designed to educate the public, which is why federal and state bureaucracies call the shots, not the parents, not the local school boards. Every law is harshly enforced with maximum punishments. The tone of a principal is much like the tone of a warden, with no check on his authority. They will always have a way of using coercive ability to enforce a standard on the population. Strict punishment awaits any kid who disobeys this ruling force, and there is no doubt that an active student body reflects positively on school administrators. It's like factory floor men. They're fulfilling their quotas to the inspecting superintendent of the local school district. This is the reality of government training. The state doesn't care if children are homeless or on the streets or suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but the second the child fails to appear in school at the scheduled time, like a court date, the police are alerted. Until we abolish mandatory schooling, your child will be brought up as a slave so that he can accept becoming a slave later in life in adulthood.
It's like something from a Hollywood horror movie. A hospital where patients are given massive doses of drugs like LSD, intensive shock therapy, put to sleep for months at a time.
I was reduced to a baby and wearing diapers and being fed, and you know, I can't imagine it. I don't remember that, thank goodness, because it would haunt me in my dreams.
But at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute, the nightmare was all too real. And incredibly, what happened there was secretly supported by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the Canadian government.
It just doesn't make sense that you can take a mother away from her children and ruin her life, and that other people won't be affected too.
I'm Bob McEwen. On this Fifth Estate, we investigate what the Government of Canada kept hidden for decades and what they're still trying to hide. It was 1964, and 5-year-old Diane McIntosh couldn't wait when her father said they were going for a drive to visit her mother, who was in the hospital.
My dad used to let me sit on his knee and steer the car, and so that was play.
On each visit, their car would turn onto the long drive leading through the hospital grounds to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, a psychiatric facility with the best reputation in the country. More than half a century later, Diane still remembers what she saw then, as if it were yesterday. Because when they got to the hospital door, her enthusiasm turned to horror.
When we got there, the place was just like a scene from One Flew Out of the Cuckoo's Nest. There were people banging their heads on the walls and droning, and my mother was sitting there completely drugged up. And even as a child, I knew that she wasn't right.
What they didn't know at the time was that her mother, Hélène McIntosh, and hundreds of others like her were unwitting guinea pigs in brutal psychiatric experiments that took place at the Allen Institute under the code name MK Ultra. Massive drug regimens, enforced prolonged sleep, intensive electroshock, largely funded by the Canadian government and the American CIA. No consent was ever asked from the patients, and no explanation of the experiments was ever given to them. The MK Ultra brainwashing project got its start in the early days of the Cold War, when some Canadian and American soldiers returning from the conflict in Korea expressed sympathy for their communist enemies. At a time of paranoia about the so-called Red Menace, the Americans believed the Soviets and Chinese might well have devised an effective brainwashing method, and the CIA was determined to crack it, as ex-CIA officer John Gittinger told the Fifth Estate in 1980.
So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
But the CIA knew it could be politically difficult to fund brainwashing directly, so it set up a front company to do it, euphemistically called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology.
These are the days and hours are the occasion.
And they found a prominent scholar doing related research in Montreal, the renowned psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron, co-founder of the World Psychiatric Association. Those who worked with Cameron called him domineering, and more.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
And it is his mind, no less, which may destroy mankind.
Over the years, in addition to CIA funding, Dr. Cameron received Canadian government research grants worth well over $4 million today for experiments on what was called psychic driving and depatterning, attempts to erase negative memories from the human mind and replace them with new, positive ones. So it was that in 1962, a 23-year-old mother of two, Elaine McIntosh, was referred to Ewan Cameron for what she thought would be a time out from the pressures of motherhood and marriage.
They promised me that I would get rested. I was told that I would be looked after in the hospital.
Depressed after the birth of her second child, her GP recommended Dr. Cameron. No one told her she would be part of a radical science project with a full menu of experimental treatments, shock, drugs like LSD, months of induced sleep with recordings bombarding her subconscious 24/7. After all that, Elaine McIntosh says she effectively became an infant again.
That was hell. It really was. It's something that you can't describe. And when I start talking about it, I start shaking. My body shakes. It's like my body's saying, don't go there.
Today, Elaine has only a few scattered memories of her years at the Allen.
Electroshock and a picture of Dr. Cameron, but I do remember him. I remember his voice very clearly.
What do you remember about it?
He sat me in front of a group of medical students or doctors that were doing their residency, and he said, "This woman is hopelessly incurable," and that was it. And he was so cold.
But through all of that, her young daughter Diane, raised by grandparents, lived for those special times when her mother got the chance to spend a few hours with her girls.
I remember when she was able to come out for a visit, and she would be able to come over and tuck me in at my granny's place, and I would just lie there immobile after she left. And when Granny would come in to say goodnight, I'd say, "Don't touch the covers, don't touch the covers, don't change it," because Mom left it this way. And I try to sleep all night without moving the covers.
In all, Elaine McIntosh spent 2 years at the Allen Institute. Most of her memories erased like data on a hard drive.
That's you.
Yeah.
Look how dark my hair is. I don't think that's...
Today, at home in British Columbia, much of the McIntosh family album is a mystery to Elaine. Now it's Diane who must guide her mom through the images of the past she no longer remembers.
There's Carolyn. So they're not in order.
No, that's me.
That's you, of course.
It is clear that in different ways, both McIntoshes are victims of that secret brainwashing project in Montreal, and they are far from alone. Hundreds of victims passed through these doors in the 1950s and 60s, all with their own horror stories.
I feel like I've been completely used. I feel like my mind has been completely invaded.
Had to be toilet trained. I was a vegetable. I had no identity, I had no memory, I'd never existed in the world before.
I had lost all
just
my
like a baby in myself.
I suffered like hell.
My mother had to stay with me all the time. She couldn't leave me 1 hour.
5 decades later, the government of Canada has been more deeply involved in all this than it wants to admit, with new secret settlements, shutting down lawsuits, and gag orders. And as you'll see after the break, it is not something they want you to know about.
The government doesn't seem to do anything. They don't recognize you. It's wrong. It's shameful.
From 1950 until the mid-60s, Montreal's respected psychiatric facility, the Allen Memorial Institute, was the site of secret brainwashing experiments, funded by the CIA under the codename MKUltra, with money from the Canadian government as well. The program would quietly be shut down in 1965. But the truth about what happened there would be protected for another decade and a half longer. Then, in 1980, we were among the first to tell Canadians about it.
The Fifth Estate.
I'm Adrienne Clarkson.
Tonight we report on a secret CIA research project carried out in Montreal in which mental patients felt they were used as the CIA's guinea pigs.
They kept you asleep for 23 days. And while I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks.
And the Fifth Estate stayed on the story for years to come. From then to now, many of the key questions have remained the same.
The Fifth Estate.
So why was Ottawa so ambiguous when it came to helping some Canadian citizens get compensation from Washington for what they endured in a program that was inspired mostly by American Cold War fears? Well, the answer was simple. The government of Canada was even more deeply involved in the Allen Memorial experiments than the Americans.
Get away!
Hold him!
After word of the experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute came out, the CBC broadcast a drama entitled The Sleep Room about Dr. Ewan Cameron's mind control treatments. In the absence of visual evidence inside the hospital, it is as close as we can come to how it looked and sounded.
Natalie?
Driving doesn't work. Can you admit that now? You destroyed these people for nothing! You can't just walk away from this, Cameron! It'll come back and it'll ruin you!
Many of them were just sitting there like zombies, and I have a headache. I don't remember anything.
Gina Blasbalg was 15 and in an orphanage when she was sent to the Allen. She got massive drug doses and was kept asleep for months. Fortunately, she never received electroshock therapy, which may explain why she remembers the real Dr. Cameron and his patients.
How did those patients regard, or apparently regard, Dr. Cameron?
Those patients were too far gone. The ones that were not too far gone were terrified of him. We were all terrified to see him around. We didn't want to be near him. I don't think that any patient ever wanted to be close to Dr. Cameron.
When news of Cameron's experiments was revealed, 9 of the Canadian victims filed a lawsuit against the Central Intelligence Agency, alleging they had been unwittingly used in research that was medically improper, even illegal. Plaintiff Velma Orlico of Winnipeg didn't think they stood a chance.
I've often, when I've been alone at home, thought, how can you fight the CIA? Who in heck do you think you are? How can you fight the CIA?
But eventually, in the late 80s, David got a concession from Goliath. The CIA settled with the Canadian patients for about $90,000 apiece. A moral victory, at least. And a few years after that, in the 90s, the Government of Canada announced its own compensation plan. But only for the most seriously injured victims, those who survived the experiments in a childlike state. The government also insisted it had no legal or moral obligation to do it. To many, that system seemed designed not to distribute compensation, but to discourage it. In the end, only 80 of the patients subjected to the brutal psychiatric experiments were approved for federal compensation. Another 250 were denied. And who knows how many more never even knew the compensation program existed. So when the application deadline came and went, and it was too late to apply, the government's secret brainwashing program simply faded into the past. Or did it?
Have you ever questioned the nature of your reality?
No. You only see what your eyes want to see.
We do not hesitate to destroy in order to create a new world.
Can't help it. I'm sorry for you.
And I for you, Thorndyke. You and your world.
Do you know what would happen then? Don't forget their Reichstag fire trial. You know their genius for producing witnesses and documents to prove their enemies guilty of what they intend to do.
Today, Europe. Tomorrow, the world.
One of the first things you learn in this business is forget about capitalism versus communism. That is absolute nonsense. The two are, behind the scenes, are hand in hand. You need the so-called conflict between the two to keep people focusing. Look, keep you looking over there, you know, capitalism versus communism. You know, that makes a nice little picture. You know, you get books on it and films on it. Capitalism versus communism. That's not where the action is. The action is over here.
They're succeeding because the American people don't understand their enemy. They don't even know what's happening. People were extolling the virtues of Pat Buchanan and actually considering voting for that man for president, and he sent them all a postcard. And on the front of that postcard, he identified himself as a high priest of the mysteries. Because on the front of his Christmas cards that he sent to all of his followers was the penis of Osiris, the phallus, the obelisk, with a nice red bow tied around the base which represented the testes. You know what he was saying to you? Are there any children in here? He was saying, he was laughing at you. And so was every other member of the Illuminati. He was a highly degreed member of the sovereign and military order of the Knights of Malta, which was taken over in the Peasants' Revolt in England by the Knights Templars, who had sworn revenge upon the old Hospitallers of St. John's, which later became the Knights of Malta because of their role in the suppression of the Templars. How many of you watch Trinity Network? How many of you watch Pat Robertson? You ever seen the cross in the crown? Do you know what that means? It's the symbol of the Templars. The Knights Templar. It is the symbol of the unification of the church and the government over the people. Is that what you want? If that happens, I'm going to have to take up arms all over again. And so will many of you, because you're going to be persecuted. You see? Because whichever one controls the government, you're going to have to conform to that teaching, and if you don't believe in it, you're a heretic. Do you understand what I'm talking about? What is our common bond truly? Freedom. Freedom. Without freedom, you can't be a Christian no matter what denomination you belong to. You can't be a Buddhist. You can't own a donut shop. You can't drive from here to Oregon. You can't be an American, because that's what it's all about, and that's the only thing that it's all about. Nothing else. Nothing else. It's about freedom.
In 1983, I heard Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney discussing the New World Order. Senator Byrd had acted in the capacity of a pimp and prostituted me to Reagan, and I was president of this White House cocktail party. Now, Ronald Reagan certainly provided a wonderful smoke and mirrors illusion for all of us. For those of you who don't want to believe that he's involved in this, he told you he's an actor. And he did a real good job of it for a long time. That was his role. That's what he was supposed to do. Nevertheless, I heard Ronald Reagan telling Brian Mulroney that he believed the only way to world peace was through mind control of the masses. I know from experience there's no peace of mind under mind control. And I wonder at a world peace where people don't have peace of mind. Mind control, the ramifications of mind control are far-reaching, because I also know that under mind control there's no free thought. Without free thought, there's no free will. Without God-given free will, there's no soul expression. What kind of a world peace can we have without any free will or any soul expression?
You took mine, never you. Forever and ever you. You took mine, never you.
One of the main focuses of the Jesuit-run New World Order is the indoctrination and corruption of the young. We have seen how this is done by proliferating perversity through popular music.
You're doing really well now, but didn't you release a CD like almost 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I released a gospel record when I was 15 because I grew up in, a household where all I ever did was listen to gospel music, and my parents are both traveling ministers, and so I kind of sang about, what was going on in my life at 15, and that's how I got introduced to the music industry. I swear I wanted to be like the Amy Grant of music, yeah. But it didn't work out, and so I sold my soul to the devil.
I'm gonna just not say what it was and just keep it to myself, just for my own personal reasons.
CBS 2's Kirk Hawkins. Kirk, good morning.
Serene, good morning to you. Right now we're waiting on an update from the coroner's office. That update could come later on this afternoon at the earliest, and we're hoping to learn more on the singer's cause of death. Of course, the body arrived here earlier this morning, very early this morning, in fact. The body of singer Whitney Houston arrived at the LA County Coroner's Office 11 hours after she was declared dead.
We're going to find out what was in her system, and I'd like to find out who, if anyone, put it in her system or gave it to her. Now, we'll charge a stem from this. Let's take a look at Anna Nicole Smith and the allegations that came down against all the people surrounding her, including her fiance, Howard Stern. Take a look at Michael Jackson, Conrad Murray. And not only that, if you recall, Archie Bunker, Carol O'Connor brought the dope dealer into court. They gave his son, Hugh O'Connor, his final hit of drugs that caused his death. So I'd like to know who was around her, who, if anyone, gave her drugs following alcohol and drugs, and who let her slip or pushed her underneath that water. Apparently no signs of force or trauma to the body.
Right.
Who let Whitney Houston go under her water?
cross in the crown? Do you know what that means? It's the symbol of the Templars. The Knights Templar. It is the symbol of the unification of the church and the government over the people. Is that what you want?
I know from experience there's no peace of mind under mind control. And I wonder, at a world peace where people don't have peace of mind, what kind of a world peace can we have without any free will or any soul expression?
Multiple other fronts, not the least of which being the televised media and education system. Infiltration and subversion of the educational system of the United States so as to set up a system whereby public education has been purposely dumbed down and where the brightest minds were recruited into institutions of higher learning under Jesuit control has been an ongoing process noted and passionately warned against by Protestant educators throughout the 19th century.
Give me a child until he is 7, and I will give you the man.
Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Maya. She was a bright, energetic young lady. Everybody thought Maya would do great things one day. Today was a special day. It was the first day of school, and Maya was looking forward to all the new things she would learn this year. But this year was not going to be exactly what Maya expected. Something was different this year. Something in school was not quite right. Maya was still learning how to read and write, and even though her homework was full of spelling mistakes, her teacher gave her a gold star. The teacher did not ask Maya to correct her spelling. Maya's mother asked the teacher why her daughter got a gold star. The teacher said that marking the spelling wrong would hurt the child's self-esteem. In the modern way of schooling, there was no right and no wrong. They now have a new way of spelling called invented spelling. She explained that the kids could spell words any way they liked. It's all correct because it's all creative. In some of the more advanced classes, they even use this method of no wrong or right in math. This way, 2 + 2 could equal 5, and no one's feelings would be hurt. Even though this seemed odd to Maya's mother, she didn't question the teacher. After all, the teacher is the professional, and surely she knows what she's doing. By the second month in school, Maya came home looking very down. She no longer was as happy as she used to be. Her mom didn't know that Maya was learning a subject called death education. All that talk about death gave Maya nightmares and made her nervous all the time. When her mom found out about death ed, it confused her. She didn't understand why young children were being taught about death. But she didn't say anything because, after all, the teacher was the professional, and surely she knows what she is doing. On the 6th week of school, Maya's mom found a test in Maya's backpack. The test was marked, "Not to be taken home." Her mom looked over the test and found questions about her personal thoughts. Do you sometimes get nervous talking in front of class? Do you ever get depressed? Do you feel like your parents are abusing you? Upon further research, Maya's mom found out that this was a psychological test given to the students without the parents' consent. The kids were offered pizza or movie tickets if they filled out all the answers. Investigating further, she found out that if the child was evaluated as high risk for depression, she would be sent to the school counselor, who would then tell the parents that the child needed medication. She also found out that most of the kids taking the test had mental problems and that they would all be asked to see the psychologist. Maya's mother was alarmed, but she let Maya see the counselor. She was worried about her little girl and felt she might need help. And after all, the counselor is a professional, and if he says Maya needs medicine, he must know what he's doing. The psychologist recommended Maya be put on a drug that would cure the chemical imbalance in her brain. The fact that she was never tested for such an imbalance didn't occur to her mom. The doctor was a professional. So each day before school, Maya would line up with all the other kids who also needed medication. A day after she started taking her meds, Maya was having more nightmares and weird thoughts. She didn't look right to her mother. So they went back to the doctor, who put Maya on a different drug. Even though she went along with all this, Maya's mom was confused. How could her daughter be getting high grades but not know how to read or write or do math? And why was her little girl, who was so happy and energetic, now so quiet and sleepy all the time? The teacher was pleased. Maya no longer spoke out in class and seemed to be more focused on her work. And now, a little history. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, decided that man had no soul. Man was just a stimulus-response animal with no self-determinism. He needed to be trained like any other animal. Supply the correct stimulus, you get the correct response, just like rats or dogs. In the early 1900s, Teachers College taught teachers the new science of psychology. These new methods of teaching would devalue academics and concentrate on behavioral techniques to mold children's values. Schools would be turned into mini psych clinics.
Give me a child until he is 7, and I will give you the man.
The Rockefeller Foundation backed Teachers College and new educators like Edward Lee Thorndike, James Earl Russell, and John Dewey, who were disciples of Wundt. Together, they rewrote textbooks and curriculum for the new American education system. This system got away from learning to sound out words using a method called phonics. It was old and too difficult, they said. They now used a new method called look-see, or whole word. All you had to do was recognize words by the way they looked, instead of learning to sound them out. And even though reading levels took a nosedive, they continued to push these new methods. They hired professional educators that believed history and geography were unnecessary burdens on young minds. Children should concentrate more on how they feel about history rather than memorizing unnecessary facts. And most importantly, the teachers and counselors should be the ones to teach moral values to the children, not the children's own parents. Parents were not professionals. 1965. Passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The number of educational psychologists in schools rise from 455 in 1969 to 16,146 in 1992. Probably just coincidentally, the number of child murderers and suicides skyrocketed as well. Certain members of the government were overjoyed with this new form of education. Controlling the behavior of people, keeping them dumb, they could pass any laws they wanted and no one would even know. Now the program was complete. Dumb them down, fill them with drugs, then indoctrinate them with facts they no longer had the power to refute. While the mental health experts were taking control of the kids away from their parents, the kids' bodies were also being poisoned, making education even harder. Fluoride, found in drinking water and hundreds of products, is actually a highly toxic industrial waste product. Fluoride is the main ingredient in sarin nerve gas used by the Nazis in World War II to make their victims docile and sterile. It's also the key dumbing down ingredient of Prozac. Here are some of the cumulative effects of fluoride. Worried about the flu? Do you know what's in the vaccine? Fact. More people die from the vaccine than die from the flu. Fact. Vaccinations have been associated with many neurological disorders. Babies are given a cocktail of vaccines before their little body's immune systems can handle it. Genetically modified foods are linked to toxic and allergic reactions, sick, sterile, and dead livestock, and damage to virtually every organ studied in lab animals. They are banned by food manufacturers in Europe and elsewhere. Yet GMOs are present in the vast majority of processed foods in the U.S. One night after Maya finished her homework, she and her mother were watching the TV together when they saw a news report come on about another mass murder at a high school. The reporter said the boy had stopped taking his meds and that his psychiatrist said that's why he killed all those people. Here's what the reporter didn't say. Side effects of the new mind-altering drugs can cause suicide and violence. All the recent school shooters were treated with these drugs. They were all troubled boys, but none of them were murderers until after they were medicated. It was raining the day they buried Maya. Nobody could understand why a 9-year-old would want to hang herself. Things like this never happened before. It was all very confusing. The school psychologist said, if only we could have gotten to her sooner.
By the time I was ready for high school, Senator Byrd
distinguished gentleman from West Virginia could be found at his desk until the very end doing the people's business. Of course, Robert Byrd was a deeply religious man, a Christian. May God bless Robert C. Byrd. May he be welcomed kindly by the righteous judge, and may his spirit soar forever like a Catskill eagle high above the heavens. Thank you very much.
By the time I was ready for high school, Senator Byrd ordered that I be sent to Muskegon Catholic Central High School. At that time, there was an enormous emergence of information. The Catholics had long since learned the effects of trauma on the human mind. They'd learned it and kept records of it for so many years, with such things as the Spanish Inquisition and other aspects where people who didn't follow the belief systems were wiped out. The Crusaders had also recorded a great deal of information pertaining to trauma on the human mind. This information was being merged with the Hitler-Himmler research that the CIA had taken and had been advancing on. The combination of the merging of the information was very powerful. And Muskegon Catholic Central was a place where this information was being brought together. It was at Catholic Central that the very basis, the very groundwork for Global Education 2000 was being implemented. This is Goals 2000, outcome-based education. There's many different names for the program that's being implemented in our school systems. It's being forced on our children by the federal government. Global Education 2000 was designed to increase our children's learning capacity while decreasing their ability to critically analyze. That way they would just readily accept whatever they were told without any question and just take all the information in.
Okay, so if I say 5 times 3, you say the answer is 15, right? 5 times 3, 15. But in the new Common Core testing, one student on the test, the way they teach it, wrote 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 15. Makes sense, right? But the teacher marked it wrong. How is that even possible? I can understand the frustration of some parents and why their students, or why they don't want their students involved in this. Because this is wrong. If it would have said 3 times 5, this answer would have been right. But because the test question read 5 times 3, the student should have written 3 plus 3 plus 3, 5 times equals 15, because it reads 5 times 3.
After I retired from military service, I began to read history books outside of mainstream publishing. I quickly discovered, to my shock I might add, that a lot of important information had been omitted from our history textbooks. I would also add from our encyclopedias. Something very sinister happened in America in the 20th century, especially in the early to mid-1900s. Jesuit-controlled Papal Rome, who hates religious liberty, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, popular representative government, separation of church and state, and our American constitutional republic, took over. And by the way, I could give quote after quote after quote by popes, archbishops, and cardinals showing that they outright hate the American constitutional republic. Took over mainstream media, the major publishing companies, and our public education system. Papal Rome did this through wealthy and influential individuals who placed their well-paid lackeys in key positions in government, in the media, in education and academia. And Burke McCarty, the author of one of the books I'm going to recommend, who wrote the Suppressed Truth about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, said that you found that a lot of these history textbook committees either had a priest or the priest's own personal representative sitting on there, and any textbook that had anything negative to Papal Rome in it, that textbook was not chosen, or it was given a choice if it was a company to edit that material negative to Papal Rome out before that textbook would be allowed in our public schools. The committees that select textbooks for student use were primary targets for infiltration and takeover. Once this takeover was complete, America was given a very carefully edited and a sanitized version of history. These lackeys of papal Rome left intact the names of generals, senators, presidents, etc. They also left intact dates of important battles. They did, however, do something that was very repugnant. They omitted many key facts, especially regarding the reasons and motives for wars, assassinations, etc., and I might add, the secret societies that were operating behind the scenes, pulling the strings on a lot of these people. Something else they also admitted was, I mentioned there, those powerful forces that often rule nations from behind the scenes, and of course that's secret societies. They certainly omitted the references to the tremendous power and influence of secret societies on the course of history, and they erased, as much as possible, as already mentioned, wherever possible, any historical guilt and sin on the part of papal Rome, and especially the Roman Catholic Jesuit order during America's history. These lackeys of papal Rome have stolen historical truth from numerous generations of Americans.
They used the Hegelian techniques, and we know enough about Hegel to know that not only does this mean the dialectic process, the creation of conflict, but it also means that individuals such as you and I, or anybody watching this program, will be cogs in the state, that we have no individual rights. Our rights for Hegel, individual rights for Hegel, come about through obedience to the state. We see it in the educational process, that we have adopted what I call a Hegelian system of education, which is not to bring out your innate talents, but to prepare you to be an individual cog in the state.
Once my father agreed to sell me into the project, I was taken routinely to Mackinac Island, Michigan, which is a political retreat where the Michigan governor's mansion is located. It was a bohemian grove of sorts where politicians met and discussed New World Order controls, where they discussed mind control of the masses, mind control in the school systems, how to use occultism as a trauma base. One of my sexual abusers at that time was the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau. Pierre Trudeau is a professed Jesuit. Now, the Jesuits are an intelligence arm of the Catholic Vatican. There's a criminal faction within these Jesuits. I'm certainly not saying all Catholics are bad, nor am I saying all CIA is bad or all politicians. There's good and bad in everything. But nevertheless, Pierre Trudeau represented this criminal faction of the Catholic Church, of the Jesuits, who believed in mind control of the masses, because they wanted to be the one world church in the New World Order. The money that was being brought in through the church was funding New World Order controls. And he firmly believed in mind control.
They do what comes next. And this, of course, is very different argument to many people who have promoted conspiracy have made. They get across the idea that these people telephone each other and have little drawings and maps and diagrams. They don't operate like that at all. If you meet these people, they think alike. They talk alike. They come up with the same ideas simultaneously, and they move simultaneously. Know what they have to do.
So they're a breed.
Exactly.
And then the priests had an army. Oh boy, weren't they happy with that? Their whole purpose throughout history has been to teach a small number of people how to become adept at controlling everyone else and presenting their societies as desirable to the profane, so that you'll go knock on the door and say, hey, can I be a member and be initiated, with the promise of learning some great secret. What is that secret? The secret is how to control everybody else. And you never understand how to control everybody else until you get to the top of this pyramid of initiation. Most people never make it past the third step. All above that are carefully chosen and nurtured and taught.
Those at the bottom may go to a Christian church and really believe that they are Christian, or attend other religions. But as they progress through the degrees of initiation, they are indoctrinated into the old pagan religions, and the old gods come back to them with a vengeance until they reach the top. They are no longer Christian. They no longer worship Allah or Buddha or any of the gods or religious beliefs that they had before. They're all gone by that time, and that's the purpose. You see, if those at the bottom were exposed all at once to what they would eventually learn through going up the degrees of initiation, none of them would stay long enough to get to the top. It is a process of slow but sure brainwashing. And it works. Works very, very good.
And Americans for all these years have been looking around for the enemy. They've never been able to find an enemy. So those who control them were able to control them even better by giving them an enemy. That's what Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt determined at Yalta. Who was going to be the enemy post-war? Turned out to be Stalin. And there was going to be this phony Cold War so that the population would never discover the real enemy. And I'm talking about the population of the Soviet Union as well as the rest of the world. You see, the enemy has always been here. It's your uncle, your aunt, your father, your mother, your brother, your sister, your nephew, your nieces, who belong to the fraternal orders collectively known as the mysteries. The very highest degrees of which, combined together, make up a secret order known as the Illuminati. Their goal is to destroy all existing religions save theirs, all existing governments save theirs, and shackle the mob in a system of eternal oppressive debt chained to a computer for the rest of their life, and a propagandized world to make them believe that they are happy in this system. Now, do you think they're succeeding? Yes. Haven't I described to you just now exactly what is going on in the world today?
About 1:30 in the morning in a hotel room in New York City, he got up, and before his CIA escort could prevent him, he ran right through a closed hotel window, which had the shade drawn over it. The window gave way, and the employee fell 10 stories to his death. Well, that account in the Rockefeller Commission report horrified most readers, but we can only imagine what it did to a Maryland woman, Alice Olson, and her 2 sons, Eric Olson and Niels Olson. They had been told 22 years ago that Frank Olson, their husband and their father, a civilian Army employee working in Maryland at the Fort Detrick Biological Warfare Research Center, after leading a perfectly normal and happy life, had inexplicably killed himself in New York. They were not told anything about the LSD experiment that had set him off, and until they read the Rockefeller Commission report 22 years afterwards, last month, they had spent 2 decades racked with the guilt and the shame that a suicide in a family causes. We spoke to the Olsons this week. Ted Clark, one of our reporters here at the Washington Bureau, reached them at their home by phone, and here is his conversation.
I'm talking to Niels Olson in Frederick, Maryland. Niels, could you tell us briefly the story of your father's death and the circumstances surrounding it?
Well, as far as we know at this point, my father, Frank R. Olson, who was a civilian biochemist working for the United States Army, died shortly after midnight on November 28, 1953. As we understand it, he had been given LSD without his knowledge at a meeting that was being held with several CIA agents who were liaison people between the CIA and the Army research installation that my father worked for. They were at a meeting discussing biological research, and during the week-long meeting in November of '53, they slipped him and four other top-level scientists LSD after dinner one evening, and then 20 minutes later they were told that they had been given the LSD, and they were going to be observed to see their reactions to the drug. He developed serious side effects to the drug, and returned from the week-long meeting to our house. My mother noticed very dramatic changes in his personality, as being very despondent and depressed and very quiet and so on. Then he went to work at Fort Detrick here in Frederick on the following Monday, and was considering resigning from his job there. Was talked back into staying on, and then Tuesday it was decided that he would go to see a psychiatrist up in New York City. The psychiatrist, Harold Abramson is his name, was a psychiatrist who had a security clearance, and therefore we were told, selected to be the therapist to talk to my father, because my father had a top-level security clearance. My father talked with Abramson for several days during the week after he had been administered the LSD. Then the Friday night, November 27th, 1953, he telephoned my mother to indicate that he was doing okay, that he'd be coming home on Saturday, November 28th. That was the last time that my mother talked to him. Then we received a phone call the next morning from a colleague who had received a phone call from a CIA agent who was up in New York with my father, accompanying him, and that was when we were notified that my father had plunged to his death out of a 10th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York.
Was any explanation given to you about why this had happened? That he had been a participant in this experiment with LSD?
No, we had no knowledge of that. We hadn't received any communication whatsoever from the Central Intelligence Agency, and the only thing we were told was that he jumped or fell from the 10th floor window, and it was our understanding that he had just suffered a nervous breakdown, and was very depressed, and my mother believed that during the middle of the night he must have had a severe nightmare, a bad dream, something where he was just compelled to go at a full run across the room, the hotel room, and leap through a window, a closed window, and the shades were drawn on the window. So that was all that we knew.
But he had, prior to this time, had led a happy life and hadn't shown any signs of depression.
No, he had not shown any signs. My mother said that they had a very good marriage. My father was a very loving person and a very giving sort of person who loved his three children very much and spent quite a bit of time with us, devoted a lot of energy towards his wife and children. And that was the thing that so threw all of his friends, his wife, and the three children, was that we couldn't understand how he had, after being such a good, warm, stable sort of person, the idea that he could suddenly develop a nervous breakdown was something we just couldn't comprehend.
When was it that you finally found out that he had been an unwitting participant in this LSD experiment?
That was on June 11th, 1975. We received a phone call from a friend who had seen a story in the Washington Post, a release of some information from the Rockefeller Commission report, indicating that from the information that they had cited in the report, that it could be no other person than our father.
And then you decided to take action against the CIA.
That's correct.
What are you going to be doing?
Number one, be able to get full disclosure of the information concerning our father's death. We feel that the information has not really been disclosed yet, and we feel that it's only through a suit will the CIA relinquish the information that they have, and all those people who have information come forward and speak frankly. In addition, we do feel that a suit will bring about some punitive damages to the CIA. We do feel that the CIA should be held accountable for their actions. I want to say my brother's about to get on the phone here.
Okay,
Eric
sure.
Olson. Hi, I'm Nils' brother.
Hi, Eric.
Hi. What's your name?
My name's Ted Clark.
You're from Pacifica?
Pacifica Radio, right.
Right, you have station BAI in California, right?
Right, BAI in New York and 2 stations in California, KPFA and KPFK.
Mm-hmm. We're on tape here, right?
Yeah. And we also have a station in Texas, KPFT.
Yeah, I know your station. They're really good.
I was going to ask if you know of anybody else, or if any of your father's colleagues who participated in the same experiment. Have you talked to any of them, or do you know who they are?
We know who one of them is, and the material which we put into our statement, some of it comes from that colleague, and he has asked us not to disclose his identity. I'm sure his identity will come out very shortly, but it hasn't so far, and we promise not to. So we know who he is. There were 3 others, according to him. One of them is dead, and we know his name, and 2 others are living, and he refused to tell us the names of those 2.
Well, I think I have pretty much the whole story. If you have any comments that you'd like to add.
There's one comment that I have.
Sure.
I don't know whether Neil said this earlier to you, but today, well, to some degree during the press conference, and especially after, we were aware that what we'd really gone through was a real funeral ceremony for our father. And it was a funeral in the sense that we were honoring him and dignifying his death in a way that he couldn't be eulogized at the time he died, because no one knew the true story, and there was a sort of mysterious shroud around the way he had died, and it didn't fit with the kind of man that his friends and family knew him to be. And there was a kind of feeling that what was happening today was really a funeral ceremony. We also are very powerful about being able to be involved in that and to make it an event that would have meaning for the whole country.
I think it will. Okay, Eric and Nils, thank you very much for taking the time. I know you must be really tired.
Yeah, we're sort of tired. So Pacifica Radio is worth it.
I appreciate your saying that.
For Pacifica in Washington, this is Robert Krulwich, with Ted Clark, Paz Cohen, Kitty Ferguson, and Paul Chaplin, who contributed to this program, wishing you a good evening.
I'm sorry.
Wipe the drool.
I was in a trance.
Yeah, wipe the drool there.
You've had a rough year. You've had a year that would test a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Illness in the family. Mm-hmm. A breakup. This spasm of publicity about what happened from Mexico to London.
It was pretty rough, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Ah, weird. Hello. Oh my goodness. Hello. Ew, strawberry. Yeah, it was a weird. Ew, I'm embarrassed. Can we stop?
In covertly recorded off-air transmissions from the Bush-Clinton presidential election campaign in the 1990s, we can see that Bill Clinton was nothing more than a puppet to the puppet masters which placed him in the White House. Bill Clinton's demeanor seems to be similar to a person who is under a hypnotic trance.
You probably heard about the voice of God inside your head. Is it real? Absolutely.
You can hear the handlers or mind prison guards inside your skull as clearly as a cell phone call. This is the synthetic telepathy that the CIA has been working on for decades.
Is this the stuff, voices in the head and things like that?
Yes.
We've run into a few people that claim they got voices in their heads, they sleep inside tinfoil boxes, they do a lot of crazy things, it seems, but when they talk to us, they seem totally normal, they seem totally sane. Are these people crazy, or is the government doing this to them?
The government's doing this to them.
Voices are very easy. And it isn't people imagining voices, they physically hear them. They physically hear, as I'm talking to you, my voice isn't inside your brain. My voice goes no further than an inch into your ear, no further at all. It's the electrical signal that makes you interpret how I sound. And once you've got this electrical signal, which can be a chip or lots of things, you can physically make people hear voices, certain voices, and it can be any conversation, and it can be anybody you want to hear. It can be a soft angelic voice, it can be a god, it can be something that scares you like a devil.
Last weekend, Netflix released Season 2 of their hit series, Stranger Things, just in time for Halloween. The show, of course, was an instant cult classic, creating millions of fans last year with its clever combination of an original sci-fi/horror plotline, with engaging and well-developed characters, and a heavy dose of 80s nostalgia. But just how original are the concepts and themes of this mega-hit series? How much of it all is actually limited to the realm of science fiction and fantasy in the first place? The channel ODD TV made an excellent video in 2016 explaining how the facility featured in Stranger Things, where the children were experimented on using trauma-based mind control techniques and sensory deprivation chambers, is a surprisingly accurate depiction of what really did occur under the Montauk Project.
The Montauk Project. The Montauk Project was a series of secret United States government projects conducted at Camp Hero and/or Montauk Air Force Station on Montauk, Long Island. It was secretly developing a powerful psychological war weapon. The Montauk Project is a continuation of the controversial Philadelphia experiment, which took place around October 28, 1943. A report was prepared and presented to Congress and was soundly rejected as far too dangerous. So a proposal was made directly to the Department of Defense promising a powerful new weapon that can drive an enemy insane, inducing the symptoms of schizophrenia at the touch of a button. Without congressional approval, the project would have to be top secret and secretly funded. The Department of Defense approved. The U.S. Air Force had a decommissioned base at Montauk, New York, not far from Brookhaven, which had a complete SAGE radar installation. This site was large and remote, and water access would allow equipment to be moved in and out undetected.
One thing they loved to do was drown you, hold you underwater to the point where you were about to give up.
They wanted to split the mind. They wanted to shatter the mind. That they would program each individual piece for something else.
But what was the intention on the beatings and the drownings? That must have...
That was to shatter the mind even further.
So they can manipulate it?
Yes, they can manipulate it.
Breaking the psyche of the person, to install programming, to fracture the mind pattern, is to make you uncomfortable. Because when you're first you're cold, then you're hot, then you're cold, and the mind doesn't know what to expect. And after a while, it fractures. Okay, when you take a personality and you fragment it into pieces, they take one of the pieces and then they develop it into a sub-personality or a related personality, which is a little different than the core personality. And then they provide a code that triggers that personality to come forward and take control of the body. There were so many different types of rituals that involved astral entities, but one of them was to create the child as a vessel, so that the entity could enter the body of the child and animate it, and then those participating in the ritual would achieve the energy of that entity that was occupying the body. There would be a chemical type of smell. They would put things in my arms, in my legs, in my genitals, in my head, and then I would hear input, voices over and over and over again, and then there'd be like this swirl. I would see this swirling vortex over my visual perception.
Researcher William Ramsey did a short video pointing out some of the symbolism in there relating to occult numerology and connections to the West Memphis Three and Damien Eccles, who is a follower of the Crowleyan religion.
11. What's that mean? What's it mean?
We find out later that her last name is Ives, I-V-E-S, which really means nothing until you find out another of the main characters' name is Byers, the same last name as one of the victims in the West Memphis 3 murders in Arkansas. In 1987, teenagers Kevin Ives and Don Henry were found dead on a railroad track in the forest of Arkansas. Initially, the death of Ives and his friend was ruled accidental, but a few months later, the ruling was changed to probable homicide. The creators of the show seem to use the same type of imagery from the West Memphis 3 murders. Winona Ryder stars as the mother of the missing child. She was also a supporter of the West Memphis 3. Here she is with Los Angeles supporters. This is Winona Ryder with Dan Stidham, the defense attorney who represented Jesse Misskelley.
I got it! Does the 7 count? Was the 7? Did Mike see it? Then it doesn't count.
I don't know.
Gons Shimura of the Face Like the Sun channel did a fantastic job delving into a lot of the spiritual and occult symbolism found in the series, as well as talking about many of the implications the story has regarding things like interdimensional contact between our plane of existence and the demonic realm.
Quote, I believe this show is popular at a surface level because of its many 80s pop culture references and a glimpse into what life was like as a preteen kid before the world of the internet, right? It's just totally different, and it appeals to that nostalgia that I've said before. People like us born in the 80s, we're the last generation to live before the world of the internet, which goes to show how huge the internet is in terms of its vehicle to promote certain concepts and ideas like it does here on Stranger Things. But the show's richness in the plot and the characters and the outright references to fringe subject matters really gives Stranger Things a depth that very few shows have achieved. But even behind all that richness and great plot and all that stuff is this really deep well of occult symbolism throughout the show, connections to pagan mythologies and deities, to the obvious references to Spielberg and the 80s style cinema, which beyond just a nostalgia thing, I think is an homage to the people in the era who really did define how to captivate an audience with a story that delivers occulted realities, to the revealing of the kinds of outcomes that resulted from mind control experiments with children like MK Ultra. It appeals to the idea of human psychology and imagination in connection to the unseen world as it bleeds into our world. It touches on the quantum anomalies that create portals and gateways into this unseen underworld. The obvious tip to the realities of electromagnetism having a huge part of this construct of how these portals and dimensions work with each other, and even the messianic symbolism laid right in front of us with one of the most important characters of the show, 11, which they call El, again, reference to God in Hebrew, or divine being in Hebrew, who recalls of the torturous experiments conducted on her in the MK Ultra program and defeats the Demigorgon, or this demonic entity in the show, by sacrificing herself. And so the show is jam-packed with these references, and there's no way I'm going to be able to touch on every single one of those references. It's just too rich. And I don't know if all of the references here were intentional or not, but it definitely has struck a chord with a lot of people, and it's become a phenomenon, which in itself says something about where we are in society. Now, on this YouTube channel, we've talked a lot about the bleed through between the unseen world and this world, you know, the spiritual dimension with this physical dimension, and, you know, how it's been happening and how the effects have been documented in many different ways, from paranormal events to now digital events, and the crossover there with a lot of the devices now that capture disembodied voices and things like that, and the many videos and photos we've seen of alleged paranormal events, some of it fake, some of it unexplained. There is a undergirding reality to this idea of openings into the other side or the other world, what the show Stranger Things calls the upside down. And it's a theme that's been shown to us throughout media. And it comes in the form of this black darkness, this deep, and really this black goo. Now, I made 2 short videos on black goo, and there are others like Nicholson 1968 who have done great videos that talk about the black goo. But there's definitely this connection to technology and this black goo. We see it in the symbolism in the Lady Gaga stuff, who obviously promotes this virtual reality. KJ mentioned, and I had the exact same thought when I was watching it, the scene from Under the Skin, where they're in this dimension of black glass that becomes goo, this substance. And if you have the eyes to see it, it's really everywhere. You see it all over the place. And this idea of a screen and this connection to technology is deeper than I think people realize. Is there a connection with all this deliberately to the monolith that was shown in Space Odyssey 2001? Is that the beginning of this opening of a portal, or this ascension, this advancement, this occult promise that is actually a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, which leads to God's judgment and the restoration of all creation? Are we seeing these elements being presented to us for a reason? And I think we have to step back and take a look at where we're at here, because the internet, which Netflix is built on the internet, right? Stranger Things is a show that's being exclusively delivered on the internet. Really, the internet is an opening into alternative realities. And our devices are just windows into all these different realms. Some of them real and, you know, edited and presented to you. Some of them not real, the world of fantasy or virtual reality or different stories, TV shows, science fiction. We've become a society that conceptually interacts with this non-corporal, metaphysical side of life, the realm of imagination. You know, we call it data or information that's gathered and presented in this medium, but that's the whole point. These ideas, these realms, these virtual worlds require a physical medium to access it. And I think the all-seeing eye symbolism has been one that's represented throughout the occult world, a representation of a window into this unseen world, or this occult underworld, the realm of the imagination that's actually bleeding into our world. And that commentary is really interesting because I believe this is a reality. I believe there is something to human consciousness and human imagination that has a direct relationship with the spiritual world and directly affects our physical world.
It is indeed extremely fascinating to look back on it all, and that section of Gauns's video specifically, and to reflect on that in light of much of the research I've been doing on my own channel involving enclosed cosmology. and the idea of overlapping spiritual dimensions, and the quantum physics arena and its relationship to occult concepts and ideology. But speaking of occult ideology, that's really the reason I felt led to chime in on this topic now with Season 2, especially in light of another Halloween and how all this ties together as yet another piece of the massive tapestry of mainstream propaganda that is, without question, pushing this Luciferian occult ideology in rather obvious ways, if only you're willing to admit it. While many people out there have been pointing out the facts surrounding the reality of things like the MKUltra programs and the connections to Project Paperclip and Montauk and so many of the black budget programs that have gone on and are still going on, which involve the weaponization and industrialization of ancient occult practices, witchcraft, and satanic ritual abuse, the one aspect that's probably not emphasized nearly enough within this peculiar circle of truther media evaluation is the simple underlying message pervading the entire series in both seasons, and probably all that might come in the future. And it's this message of how the protagonists face off against this mysterious and terrifying combination of covert government agendas and these nightmarish supernatural entities from some dark dimension. The thematic visuals that dominated the trailers and the artwork for the Series 2 really encapsulates it all perfectly. The four boys of this group of friends, finally reunited after Will was missing for pretty much the entirety of Season 1, they get dressed up for Halloween as the Ghostbusters. And this is more than just more 80s nostalgia. This is basically the epitome of the whole show. And it's actually kind of a perfect way of stopping and reflecting on the fact that, in many ways, the 1980s, which is a decade that I lived through as a child myself, it was a time when this theme of the supernatural and horror, aliens, poltergeists, all of it just really exploded in movies and pop culture, along with, there was always the average Joe heroes who were always so common in the 80s material, who would rise up to stand against, whatever out-of-this-world threat was coming at them. Both Series 1 and 2 of Stranger Things utilizes the game Dungeons & Dragons as a sort of plot device through which the boys use various characters and elements from the quote fantasy game to help explain various features and phenomenon they are encountering in the real world. Yet, ironically, this is precisely what Dungeons & Dragons was designed to do in the real world, as it introduces a wide variety of concepts to the players that are straight out of the arena of witchcraft and the occult. And what's more, this is also exactly what all those movies from the 80s like Ghostbusters, Gremlins, Aliens, E.T., It, The Shining, so on and so forth, that's what they were all doing as well. And that's what Stranger Things is continuing to do, right now. The entire horror movie genre is itself a form of trauma-based mind control, being disseminated to the public at large. The thousands of poor innocent children who were, and still are undoubtedly, victims of satanic ritual abuse and various Montauk-related experiments over the years, they had no choice in the matter. Yet millions upon millions of people out there are now willingly exposing themselves to horrific imagery, violence, rape, paranormal apparitions, and monsters, and all the rest, all in the name of entertainment. So people now actually pay to be subjected to, quote, low-level forms of trauma, ostensibly for the alleged cathartic effect. Cathartic in the sense that it's the whole notion of watching something in order to try and, not be scared by it, to see if you can endure the carnage or the suspense or whatever, and, in short, to become desensitized. Season 2 of Stranger Things adds the introduction of another survivor from the facility named Kali, which is yet more obvious symbolism, especially when you place that alongside the name El for 11, since both those names are associated with the names of deities. And Kali teaches El to use her power more effectively, to control and channel her inner turmoil and emotional pain from the trauma and abuse and use it to her advantage. So there are several layers of messaging going on there. On a more generic level, it's the message of, emotional healing and personal growth essentially being a self-guided and self-accomplished process. Dealing with the past, painful memories, relational hurts, internal psychological and developmental obstacles, all this, overcoming that by way of mastering those internal issues on your own, maybe with someone else's help, but something that you piece back together yourself without the need for things like forgiveness or redemption from a higher power. In short, it's the message that you don't need some external God to experience healing and wholeness in your life. At the same time, there's also the very pronounced message of glorifying the occult powers that Elle received as a result of her time spent in the horrors of the secret program. So even though the process by which she was enhanced in that way was evil, the powers themselves are not considered evil, they're just can be used against evil, and that's the real key. Her powers are actually ultimately portrayed as the only thing that's capable of saving herself, saving her friends, and even the town as a whole from the interdimensional demonic threat. That's extremely, extremely important, because this is where the deceptive nature of the message is at its most subtle and yet most significant. Not surprisingly, it's really the same message, the same sort of plot that we who grew up in those nostalgic 80s, we saw over and over and over again. And now we see them being constantly rehashed and re-released for the younger generations, not just in the throwbacks and culture nods of Stranger Things, but even in things like the new Ghostbusters movie with the female cast. And they just did a remake of Stephen King's It, where, just like in The Goonies and Stand By Me and the E.T. and all those motifs, the group of nerdy kids bands together and faces the danger together as a team. And so, in this familiar Spielberg-esque treatment of magic and sci-fi that so many of us grew up with, it's really the same thing over and over again. It's the same with Lucas and Star Wars, which, coincidentally is still going stronger than ever, still glamorizing the same telekinetic powers of the Force that we see Elle use in Stranger Things. The craziest thing about the Netflix series to me is how it blatantly portrays the crossover of concepts from magic and witchcraft, as pulled from the D&D references, into the quote scientific manifestations of those same creatures and dimensions in the real world. And in that way, it's like the perfect snapshot. It's a very helpful analogy, I'd say, not just for the rampant expansion of such occult propaganda in the 80s, but really the entire 20th century as a whole could be understood in that way. It really would not be stepping out of bounds to go so far as to say that this is essentially the entire purpose of science fiction across the board. What it boils down to is the introduction and normalization of concepts and themes and ideologies to the public at large that, for most of human history, were limited to the pages of rare Necronomicons and closely guarded Kabbalistic texts and outlawed scrolls full of spells and invocations and rituals. One of the most ubiquitous tenets of occult thinking throughout all of history has been the belief that the spiritual realms are inhabited by both good and evil entities, and all sorts of species and races and such, and that it is within the capability of the adept, of the sorcerer, if you will, to not only discern for themselves which of those entities are good and which are evil, but to eventually be able to overpower and defeat the evil entities, if they embrace and learn to utilize the mysterious forces and rules of our magical interdimensional reality. And this is what every piece of propaganda coming from Hollywood has been pushing our entire lives. And almost without exception, the evil entities, be they presented as spirits or demons or aliens or monsters or whatever, they always wear their evil on their sleeve. They're always just super obvious in their destructive intentions. Whereas the entities who want to teach us how to develop our powers, to achieve our full potential, are always the good guys, the helpers, the benevolent ones. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if in Stranger Things Season 3 or somewhere down the line they perhaps introduce some new creature, some new benevolent entity from somewhere on the other side. Perhaps some other dimension being threatened as well. I mean, if there's the upside down, maybe they'll come up with the inside out or the... I don't know. But maybe they'll have some entity that'll come and start to teach all the kids how to use their psychic powers and not just Elle. Who knows? But all in all, the strangest thing about Stranger Things isn't just the fact that it reflects so many topics and themes that are a part of real conspiracies involving secret government projects and interdimensional entities and the development of things like psychic powers and dimensional portals and all the rest. It's the fact that even the show, Stranger Things, is itself actually a part of that grand conspiracy. That, quote, ancient work, the Mystery Babylon agenda. Far more than even most conspiracy researchers even realize.
We get almost all of our information from the media. If we base our opinions on bad or biased information, then everything we believe is suspect. Political debate today is kept within very narrow boundaries, so the media can present both sides of these narrow positions and give the impression we have a free press. However, to talk about left or right-wing press is to miss a very important point. Whatever message big business wants carried, with whatever slant, the media will carry that story unfailingly.
Well, the title is actually borrowed from a book by Walter Lippmann, written back around 1921, in which he described what he called the manufacture of consent as a revolution in the practice of democracy. What it amounts to is a technique of control. And he said this was useful and necessary because the common interests, the general concerns of all people, elude the public. The public just isn't up to dealing with them, and they have to be the domain of what he called a specialized class. Notice that that's the opposite of the standard view about democracy. There's a version of this expressed by the highly respected moralist and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who was very influential on contemporary policymakers. His view was that rationality belongs to the cool observer, but because of the stupidity of the average man, he follows not reason but faith. And this naive faith requires necessary illusion. The point is that in a military state or a feudal state or what we would nowadays call a totalitarian state, it doesn't much matter what people think, because you've got a bludgeon over their head and you can control what they do. But when the state loses the bludgeon, when you can't control people by force, and when the voice of the people can be heard, you have this problem. It may make people so curious and so arrogant that they don't have the humility to submit to a civil rule, and therefore you have to control what people think.
100 years ago, Sigmund Freud, famous for giving us the science of psychological analysis, suggested that the ideal of individual freedom, central to the idea of democracy, was impossible. He said our hidden desires were too dangerous. Human beings could never be allowed to fully express themselves, that we must always be controlled and would thus always be discontent. Sigmund Freud's American nephew was Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on our society is possibly much greater than Freud. Bernays took the new science developed by his famous uncle and used it to manipulate the masses. Bernays is the man who invented the profession and the term public relations. He worked for most of the major corporations and advised politicians on how to win favor with the public. Like Freud, Bernays was convinced that humans were driven by irrational forces, but by stimulating our inner desires and then sating them with consumer products, he created a new way to manage the irrational behavior of the masses.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress.
He had a home in the corner suite of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. And here's this wonderful suite with all these windows looking out on Central Park and across at the plaza and on the square. And he would use this place to hold a soiree. The mayor would come. All the media leaders would come, the political leaders, the business leaders, the people in the arts. I mean, it was a who's who. People wanted to know Eddie Bernays because, you know, he himself became a sort of a famous man, a sort of a magician who could make these things happen.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Democracy, to my father, was a wonderful concept, but I don't think he felt that all those publics out there had reliable judgment, and that they very easily might vote for the wrong man or want the wrong thing, so that they had to be guided from above. You appeal to their desires and their unrecognized longings, that sort of thing. That you can tap into their deepest desires or their deepest fears and use that to your own purposes.
Many influential thinkers came to believe that the public were incapable of making rational decisions, and that as such, democracy could never work. Walter Lippmann, one of the most influential political writers at that time, argued that if people were in reality motivated by irrational forces, then what was needed was control by the elites to manage what he called the bewildered herd. And this could be accomplished by using psychological techniques to control the unconscious desires of the masses.
So here you have Walter Lippmann, probably the most influential political thinker in the United States, who is essentially saying that the basic mechanism of the mass mind is unreason, is irrationality, is animality. He believes that the mob in the street, which is how he sees ordinary people, are people who are driven not by their minds but by their spinal cords. The notion of kind of animal drives, unconscious instinctual drives lurking beneath the surface of civilization. And so they started looking towards psychological science as a way of understanding the mechanisms by which the popular mind works, specifically with the goal of figuring out how to understand how to apply those mechanisms to strategies for social control. Democracy, at its heart, was about changing the relations of power that had governed the world for so long. And Bernays' concept of democracy was one of maintaining the relations of power even if it meant that one needed to sort of stimulate the psychological lives of the public. So democracy is reduced from something which assumes an active citizenry to the idea of the public as passive consumers. Driven primarily by instinctual or unconscious desires, and that if you can in fact trigger those needs and desires, you can get what you want from them.
The corporations understood that to change our consumer culture from needs-based to desire-based purchasing, people must be trained to want new things even before the old had been consumed.
Bernays really is the guy within the United States more than anybody else who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses.
He showed the corporations how they could make people want things they did not need by linking products to their unconscious desires. And the mass media would be the key.
The media and marketing men spend billions of dollars in research. They have developed an entire science based on the very best psychology that knows exactly which one of our buttons to press to make us swallow an idea or buy a product. And they're not just selling us laundry detergent. They sell us everything from plastic gadgets to warfare. If we are to make decisions about the future of our society, the single most important thing we need is the truth.
It is odd to watch with what feverish ardor Americans pursue prosperity, ever tormented by the shadowy suspicion that they may not have chosen the shortest route to get it. They cleave to the things of this world as if assured that they will never die, and yet rush to snatch any that comes within their reach, as if they expected to stop living before they had relished them. Death steps in the end, and stops them, before they have grown tired of this futile pursuit of that complete felicity which always escapes them. Alexis de Tocqueville.
In a study of mind control and psychological warfare, it is not enough to simply review the latest technology of coercion, the most recent gadgetry and techno junk, littering the hardware and supply depots of governments and cults. Far more dangerous than these appliances is the praxis behind them, the underground current which informs the modern project and this era. Life in our modern era being little more than life in an open-air mind control laboratory, where a form of human alchemy has emerged to transform the mass of targeted percipients, targeted merely by virtue of their being urban dwellers plugged into the electronic and digital pageantry of the establishment's system of things. And what sort of creature is it that inhabits such a domain? Who is the modern man? The puppet masters say that he is the smartest, most advanced individual to ever strut the planet, the most relatively liberated being in history. But Louis Ferdinand Céline, the great French novelist, said it well. What does the modern public want? It wants to go down on its knees before money and before detritus. The public have been trained to do this by two principal methods: direct speaking archetypal messages of pure terror, very similar to the experiments of Dr. Ewan Cameron of McGill University's Allen Memorial Clinic, which he described as psychic driving, these being encoded in certain massively publicized lone nut mass murders, and by the sinister flattery heaped upon the modern public by their masters in the cult of progress and optimism. The acid test of a human being's freedom and will to protect the quality of life lies in a person's attitude toward their oppressors. What is modern man's attitude toward Wall Street and the big bankers, toward Dan Rather and the ignorance-bestowing media and advertising man, toward Wilson and FDR and Reagan and the politicians who waste their sons in bankers' wars? As one writer has observed, The most amazing thing about the American people is that they are constantly defending their betrayers. Who then is the modern man? He is a mind-bombed patsy who gets his marching orders from Twilight language key words sprinkled throughout his news and current events, so that even as he dances to the tune of the elite managers of human behavior, he scoffs with great derision at the idea of the existence and operation of a technology of mass mind control. Modern man is much too smart to believe anything as superstitious as that. Modern man is, in fact, the ideal hypnotic subject. Puffed up on the idea that he is the crown of creation, he vehemently denies the power of the hypnotist's hold over him, even as his head bobs up and down on a string. Mind control attempts to achieve within the percipient three destructive conditions: amnesia, or loss of memory, abulia, or loss of will, and apathy, or loss of interest in events vital to one's own health and survival. Amnesia, abulia, and apathy are universal in Western society and gaining a greater foothold with each day.
This goes all the way back to the Nazis. They believe that they can create, and we've all heard this, God-men or super, soldiers, but they call it the master race. So their version of this back then in the late 30s was to find Germans who had what they called the Aryan blood. They believed, and for us it would be the Nephilim blood. This is what they believed, whether we believe it or not. They believe they are being guided to backbreed so that they can reproduce what they called God-men. And that's history. That's what they attempted. What we didn't know was the details of that. And of course, after the war in the mid-40s, then that was kind of we thought it was off the table. Well, what occurred was when Himmler began to do this, his goal was to have 200 million super soldiers for the future, so that when they conquered the world, they have a 1,000-year reign. They would rule and reign with these soldiers. They would be stronger, faster, and again, their version, God-men, small g. So when the war was over, the rat lines took the Nazis, the SS, the scientists all over the world. And 20 years, 25 years later, all of a sudden, we have these individuals showing up at psych wards and counseling centers. At first, they're diagnosed as schizophrenic, but then they realize, no, these are not. The American Psychological Association, and worldwide, by the way, they had to decide, hey, who are these people? Because they're showing up by the hundreds in the 70s, then by the tens of thousands in the 80s. The estimates were into the millions in the 90s, and it's like, where are they coming from? They diagnosed them in the secular sense and called it multiple personality disorder. It is now dissociative identity disorder, and they also recognized that the process was a trauma-based splitting human personality and the creation of separate sub-alter personalities. That's where in the 70s, 80s, I mean, across the United States even, we began to hear about satanic ritual abuse. Police stations, police detectives began to be trained in the late 80s. In the 90s, I got involved on that side of the fence in the police academy and helping to train. But nobody knew. They just saw victims. They saw people that were just damaged, and everybody's been trying to help them. But we realized that the process was satanic rituals, the demonization of these individuals, and then the more we looked into it, the more we engaged, the victims. Well, we found some that came right out of U.S. military, Fort Bragg, Psy Warriors. This goes back to Goat Lab. This goes back to the Operation Paperclip. When these scientists were brought over, they brought a technology that they were already learning under Mengele and the other scientists, and I believe again, dark powers guided them in all this process. So we've heard now of MK Ultra, Monarch, goes back to the Marionite programming. We've heard all of this, and that information is all about 50, 60 years old. What we don't hear on the secular side of it is the vast development of the underground, the demonic side of this, and I believe a technology that they have come up with to, in their version, their own words, to create the troops of Antichrist for the future. When they split a person's personality, their goal is to program it for what they want within what is called the system inside. Then with the programming, then they want to summon a demon and infuse it into that personality, put that personality down by code, so that it's inside, and the main person, this is their intent anyway, is not even supposed to know. That main individual is not even supposed to know what's inside of them. But if a coven member, handlers they're called, would call out the trigger or call on the phone and give the trigger, the sub-personality with that trigger phrase would come up.
Yes. Sergeant Shaw. Who is this? Sergeant Raymond Shaw. Yes. Raymond Prentice Shaw. Yes. Listen. Go to the bedroom of your suite. Enter the hallway there. Go to the end and open the closet. Raymond Prentice Shaw.
They want to summon a demon and infuse it into that personality.
Yes.
The title, the mind has a natural ability. Now let's say that you're a soldier in a war, and this has been going on for thousands of years to soldiers in wars. Let's say your buddy, for instance, has his arm blown off and his guts are blown out, and it's a horrible sight. The mind protects itself, and if you look at it on a timeline, and at this point in time is that trauma, if the trauma is severe enough, what the mind does to protect itself, it builds amnesia walls around that trauma. Well, the Illuminati learned this a long time ago, and so what they do is they compartmentalize the mind. They take a small child and they just traumatize the heck out of it and split the mind and build all these amnesia walls between all these traumas. The worse the trauma, the better, because the better the trauma wall. So the most horrendous traumas you can possibly imagine are the ones that they want to use. When you splinter the mind up into many pieces, of disassociated pieces, then you can go in and pull that piece up to the front of the mind, and you can construct out of that piece of memory whatever you want out of it.
It's been decided that you will be dressed as a priest.
In order to make a functioning computer, the big hurdle that they had to jump over was to be able to create memory that you couldn't access. Well, that's what they're doing with the mind. They're splintering up your memory into thousands of little pieces.
You will have absolutely clear, protected shooting.
My co-author on a couple books on the mind control, her mind was split 30,000 ways. Now, you take those pieces of the mind, yeah, tremendous amount of trauma. Think of the amount of trauma it takes to split the mind and then multiply that times 30,000 times. Tremendous amount of trauma all through these people's lives.
Here and believed here. Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?